Start with the Lord of prayer. And Father, I thank you that you are patient, that you continue to work with us and help us in our weakness. Lord, I pray for our time together as we look at the issue of stewardship, specifically of money. Lord, I pray for we would have your thoughts, your mind, your understanding, and represent things appropriately so we may value in the way we use the resources you've given us. Please guide our class. May your Spirit guide our conversation and help us to sharpen one another. Lord, we ask for growth. In Jesus' name I ask. Amen. We've been talking about stewardship, and a couple of key principles we've covered so far is that we were created to be productive. We're created to work, created to produce. And so the purpose of that production is for the glory of God. And we had many scriptures we could run to, but we covered a few just to kind of outline it. Then we moved on to that as people that are producers for God, we are placed as stewards in this world, and we have many things we are stewards over. Not only money, which is kind of what drew us into this conversation, but also time and thoughts. We talked a little bit about those last week, but essentially everything that we've been given to produce and to live with is given at the hand of God. By His grace, by His mercy, He's redeemed us, and therefore our lives are His, both before and then doubly so after. And so we need to be mindful of how we're using that time, that we actually use that time, that energy, that thought process, that money in a way that is glorifying God and productive. And if it's not, we have a problem. Then we're being bad stewards. So we've discussed that a lot. We've kind of wrestled through it. I want to take the next few steps and look at some examples of stewardship given in scriptures briefly. And then I want to bring up some principles that stewardship directly leads to in a practical standpoint. We're only going to introduce it, and I'm going to probably cover it a little more deeply in a few weeks from now. But we'll get there in a second. Why don't we start with some scriptures? Can someone look up Haggai 1 for me? Actually, let's just turn over there and go. Haggai chapter 1. This is one example of bad stewardship. So we'll start with a couple of bad examples and then go to a couple of good examples. Haggai chapter 1, verses 3 through 11. I guess just to give some context while we're reading this, many of the minor prophets through here are talking to the Israelites as they have fallen further and further away from God, have rejected Him more, turned to idolatry, and God is in the process of putting them away into captivity or actually destroying part of them, as we see with the Samaria side. And so in this process, there are many prophets that come to the people saying, hey, wake up, here's what you're doing. Make a change, recognize where you're at. And here's one of the many passages along those lines. So, could someone read for me? What did I say? 3 through 11. Chapter 1, 3 through 11. Okay, John, go ahead.
Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. It is a time for you yourselves to be a living in your paneled houses, while the house remains a ruin. Now this was the Lord Almighty says, give careful thought to your way. You have planted much, but have harvested little. You eat, you never have enough. You drink, you never have your fill. You put on your clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Be careful to your ways. Go up onto the mountain and bring down timber and build the house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expect much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty, because of your house which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with his own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld the dew, and the earth is crops. I called for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain, the new wine, the oil, and wherever the ground produces, on men and cattle, and on the labor of your hands.
All right, so translate this for me into something that we can relate to. What's actually being called out with Israel? What are they doing that's a problem? Yeah, Jeff?
You're ignoring me and focusing on yourselves.
Yeah, that's essentially what God's saying. You're ignoring me, you're focusing on yourself. I would argue they happen to bring up the specific issue of the temple. I don't actually think that's the issue. I think it's more the way you described this, Jeff. It's you're not paying attention to me, you're only caring about yourself. You're not making sacrifices, you're not using your time, money, energy for God, essentially is what's being called out here. So the temple was one example that was given that clearly they're spending a lot of effort doing what with their money? What does verse 4 tell us?
Living in luxury, basically.
It says, hey, you're dwelled in your paneled houses, yet my house lies desolate. You're living it up, you're enjoying yourself, yet you're not paying attention to me, is what essentially being called out here. So verse 9 says something similar. You look for much, but behold, it comes to little. When you bring it home, I blow it away. Why? Now, I guess we fall into the same category of the Israelites at this point. At some point, you see in the Israelites' history, they look up, and when something bad happens, there's a drought, there's an earthquake, there's something happens. What do? They look up to the Lord and say, okay, why did this happen? I'm sick. Lord, why are you making me sick? And then there's a shift that happens at some point, which is being described here, where bad things are happening, and they're like, well, did I not do the right incantation for my idol? Or did I not hold my hand in the right way when I was trying to plow the crops? There's all this types of just, where's the source? But they never look up. And that's one thing that God keeps calling them out. And I think very similarly we have that today. When bad things happen, when things that don't go our way, are we people that actually acknowledge that God is actually active and involved in our lives? Or have we written that off and say, well, this is just circumstance. This is just the way things are. There's a big shift here in the way of thinking. So if you think it's just circumstances, what do you do to resolve it? Versus if you believe that God is actually interacting with you, allowing you to experience calamity at times, allowing yourself to have blessing at times, it changes the way you respond, the way that what pathway you choose to correct your life. So in this particular passage, he's calling him out on it, saying, hey, you're not asking the right questions, you're not where you need to be, you're just focused on yourself. And then, verse 9, you look for much, but behold, it comes a little. So you're looking for this answers, and you're doing all you know to go, and then it's still not happening, and still you're not looking up at me. So we hear this type of message a lot throughout the Old Testament. So in verse 6, it says, you have sown much, but harvest little. You eat, but there's not enough to be satisfied. You drink, but there is not enough to become drunk. You put on clothing, but no one is warm enough. And he who earns wages to put into purses with holes. Can y'all relate to that mindset? I mean, I'm making X number of dollars a year and I still can't pay for my food. I mean, I think there's a common thread throughout America today. I guess what I would argue, verse 6 is a lot of what we've been talking about, this stewardship. Remember the passage we wrestled with the past couple of weeks that deals with the talents or the minas given to, the talents of minas here. When those servants were given minas and money and said, go manage this and do well with it, the ones that did well with it got what?
Got more.
Got more. So the one who brought back 10 minas was given an extra one from the one who Didn't do so well. What happened to the one who did not do well with it, did not try, was not a good steward? He was kicked out. The minnow was taken away from him and handed to the guy who had the most. This is the principles you see throughout Scriptures. Those who have done well. Matter of fact, if you read Luke, you read this passage, we're going to cover this passage in more detail later, but I do want to just highlight this first. Chapter 16, verse 10 of Luke, it says, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much." And then he goes on to say, "If you therefore you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous money, who will entrust you with true riches?" So I think we get a principle here, seen many times in Scriptures, and I think it's coming out in Haggai here also, this saying, you guys are not managing what I've given you well, and therefore no matter how hard you work, I'm continuing to take it away. You're still struggling, still scarce, until you look up at me and we can make things right. So, another example of bad stewardship. Let's turn to Malachi, over a few pages, chapter 3. This is actually what John was bringing up last week, which we won't spend long on since we did briefly mention it, but I want to quickly read it. 3:8 through 12. Someone read that for me? Malachi 3:8 through 12? Go ahead, Rebecca.
Will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how do we rob you? In tithes and offerings. You are under a curse, the whole nation of you, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room enough for it. I will prevent pests from devouring your crops, and the vines in your fields will not cast their fruit, says the Lord Almighty. Then all the nations will call you blessed, for yours will be a delightful land, says the Lord Almighty.
So what's happening here? Another good example, I think, or another bad example where God's calling them to task. But what's happening here that God's calling them to task for?
They're not tithing, they're trusting in Him.
So they're not tithing. And what does that actually mean in the context of the passage? Why do we care if we tithe? How does it play out in Israel? Actually mentions it a couple verses down. Yeah, Jeff?
Well, I mean, there were specific quantitative, there were specific things that they were supposed to give.
Right.
And they knew what those things were.
Mm-hmm.
But, they were only giving half as much, and the rest, maybe they were keeping for themselves or wasting it, I don't know, but they weren't giving God what He'd asked for. And presumably, since it's based on what they have, they could have done that.
So there are, let me draw, there's two primary principles for the tithe. One is that the tithe is how this whole area of the ministers that God has set up, the Levites, would live. This would take care of their needs and responsibilities. They didn't get an allotment of inheritance. They simply got this tithe. There's a second group of people that got the tithe. Anybody know who that is? We've been talking about on Wednesday night. Yeah.
I'm guessing, would it be the widows and the orphans?
Very good. The widows, the orphans, and the foreigners. Those that are in need, in the deepest of need around, are being taken care of out of this tithe. This is why they mentioned here in verse 10, it says, so that there may be food in my house, test me in this. So there's this argument that they have a calling to take care of the poor and needy among them, and to the ministers that have given their lives in service to God. And he says, all right, you're going to take care of this. It's your responsibility, therefore this tithe has to come in and take care of it, and it's not happening. You're robbing me. Now, that brings up the second part, which I don't think is the primary reason for a tithe, but it's closely coupled with it. It's more, or if you could even say two sides of the same coin. One side of the coin is we're helping the needy. We're helping those that God has called into service. And what's the other side of the coin? Is what it does to me. When I give my first fruits, when I give a tenth of what I have plus additional as the needs come up, what does that say about my faith?
trusting God's gonna take care of you later on.
Right, because honestly, those first fruits come in, they're my life. If I bring the first crops in, what happens if that's all I get and I gave that to God? I have nothing to live on. I have no future because those crops also have the seeds which are next year's crops. So if I take the very first things that come out and I say, God, it's yours, thank you. I trust that you're going to provide. I'm making a major leap of faith here, a major step that says, okay, yes, I understand that you provided this for me, that it wasn't by simply the work of my hands, but it was the work of my hands coupled with your grace, with your taking care of me. And by that fact, I can easily say, here, I can rejoice and give this back to you here. Because I know tomorrow I'm going to go back out there and there's going to be plenty for me. Because you are the provider. That's what it states. And that's that's the other side of the coin. It's a major step of faith that says, I believe that God is actually active. Not some distant God, not some non-existent God, but He's powerful and active and interacting in my day-to-day life. Therefore, if I give Him these first fruits of my day-to-day work, He's going to take care of me. Yes. Perfect.
So is that a leap of faith we should take?
I believe that's we're commanded to.
So that means we should take out God's portion before rent and everything else. Like if we have rent money, we should pay it all to God, right?
There's a simple answer to your question, yes. More difficult question gets into the nature of budgeting. How do I manage and take the income? I believe we're supposed to take the money that comes in, we prioritize to give back to God. And that comes in many fashions, not simply putting the plate, that's one piece of it. But then what comes next? Well, it's the things that are required for my family, my house, my food, my heating. And then what happens after that? Other things. And so there is a priority there. And I would say, yeah, the way I try to structure my budget is that the first thing that comes off is for whatever I've said, this is what I believe I need to give to God, I want to give to God, I take that off first, and then I go from there. Now, I don't always do that as well as I would like. That I believe is the principle, though, that shows I'm walking in faith. So, yeah, I would say that is kind of the principle. All right, so let's look at give a positive example here, one that we're fairly familiar with. If you'd like to turn to Luke 10, you can follow along. I'm not going to read this whole passage because we read it a lot. But the Good Samaritan was going down the road. Let's see if we get in the verse. Yeah, verse 30 through 37 is the story where God's describing what it is to be a neighbor. And the Good Samaritan is going down the road and he sees someone in need. And what does he do? Helps him out, right? Furthermore, doesn't only help him out, but takes him to an inn, pays for the inn, gives extra money for the inn to say, take care of whatever his needs, and if it takes more than this, when I come back, I will take care of it. All right, so what does that tell you about this example that God's given us to understand how to be a neighbor? What does it describe that neighbor financially? How is it described financially? Is he rich?
Maybe not, but
We
he's a
don't know.
good steward of what he
Right.
does have to be able to do what he's doing.
Exactly. So we don't know if he's rich. Probably not. Maybe so. I don't know. But what we do know is that he's not sitting living in debt, owing to every man and have no penny on him. He's managed his money well enough that he can give enough money to extra out of his normal budget to take care of someone in need. And it may have hurt him to do it. That's okay. But he's able to. And that's a big step. How many of us may live week to week where if someone needs $50, we can't even begin to think about where that would come from because we can't even pay our own bills. Matter of fact, we can't afford, if a need comes along, we can serve, we can help. And we're not only are we, well, I do believe that pulling out of from our excess to help those is very biblical in nature, and even if it hurts us a little to help where we feel called, that's great. But Also, it's great to budget and say, hey, I'm gonna plan for this, so that when the time comes, I'm actually looking for the opportunity instead of waiting for it to hit me in the face. I'm gonna look for opportunities to serve, and I'm gonna have some mercy money set aside, so when that need comes along, I can say, here's $50, here's $100 here, let's go to the store, I'll buy some groceries, or hell, let me take care of that rent payment. Whatever it may be, we can begin to come alongside people and help. Now, I understand that that's poverty alleviation is a big question, difficult question. We will talk a little more about this, but it's a little outside the scope. How do you best help without being an enabler, but actually serve? And there's lots of good questions that need to be dealt with. But if we don't have the money, it's irrelevant. You can't help at all. And problems often require money. Also require knowledge and other things. But think about your walk through your works. If you've worked for more than 10, 15 years, do your salary go up like this? Does it stay flat? How's God provided for you in those measures? There's a nature of stewardship here that I believe we will see direct fruit from. Just like the particular crops, I'm going to give those first fruits, that livelihood, that hope of the future to God, and then I'm going to turn around and relish what God is doing at that point. That spirit, which in Malachi they weren't doing, which it says, you rob me, therefore I keep holding back. But if you just give me what you're supposed to give me and show that you trust me, I'm going to open the floodgates of heaven and bless you richly. And we see lots of these microcosms throughout scriptures. And I think we need to be mindful of that also. Put our focus where it belongs. Show that we recognize that it's not me working for Maxim that is providing money for my family. It is God taking care of my family. And He's using Maxim at the moment to do that. Do I have to be responsible at Maxim? Absolutely. Do I have to work hard with all my heart as working for the Lord and not for men? Absolutely. But in the end, if I get put up with some moral issue that says that if I argue with my boss or refuse to do something that's immoral, and I'm going to lose my job, and I fear losing my job more than fear dishonoring God, I've put my faith in the job, not in God. Because if I truly know that I'm a steward for God, and God is providing in this way at this particular moment, and I have something that I lose my job on, okay. So what's next, Lord? You're going to give me another job tomorrow? Am I going to be without for a while and learn to manage? I don't know, but I know that you have me. That's the spirit with which we're supposed to approach this. Now, let's I want to jump into some more practical steps here. When we look at the nature of stewardship, one second. I was wanting to read a passage here before going. Nope, I already got that. All right, sorry, I'm just following my lines here. Okay, so 1 Samuel 2, 1 through 10, it says, God makes a man poor or rich. If you'd like to turn to that, and then I want to talk a little bit about where we go from here practically. So 1 Samuel chapter 2. We have very similar passages throughout the Psalms and through the Proverbs, but it's good to remind ourselves of what scriptures say about this. This is Hannah actually calling out to the Lord in her prayer. My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There's no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one beside thee, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge. And with him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and rich. He brings low, he also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust, he lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor. for the pillars of the earth and the Lord's, and he set the world on them. He keeps the feet of his godly ones, for the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. Those who contend with the Lord shall be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed. This is a picture, this is a song of Hannah after she's been given a child when she was barren. But the truths that come out are not something you see only here, you see them throughout scriptures. Even back to the words of God when he's talking directly with Moses and says, who makes a man see or blind? God takes credit for the world shifting. We see him in more mighty ways, taking a man like Nebuchadnezzar, brings him to the leader of the known world of Babylon at the time, and then takes him down to where he's crawling around in the grass eating grass. People think he's crazy and ignore him. And then take him from there back up to leader of the known world. Who can do that? I mean, that's not possible. Imagine President Obama taken out of office, down on the ground eating grass like a crazy man, and then being put back into a place of preeminence. Or Trump, or whoever, This is hard to imagine. It's not even possible. Yet God did that, and he does many things like that throughout history. The difference is that we have to grapple with it. Am I the person that doesn't believe that God is active and working in these things? Therefore I fear circumstances alone. Or do I know that God is bigger than circumstances and I put my trust there and order my life underneath, waiting for the Lord to deliver? That's the picture. So if we get back to the nature of stewardship, if you take this approach, the nature of stewardship, that says, here's how I'm going to manage the time, the money, the thoughts. How does that influence when we take the particular concept of money? How should we approach that if we're going to be faithful stewards? Think about that. Let me give you a couple of examples that might get your thoughts going. Let's say I have a mentor that says, hey Chris, you're struggling with time management. I've got a great book that goes through some basic principles of things we've been talking about. I'm going to give you this book and I want you to read through it, and we're going to get back and we're going to talk through it. Sound reasonable scenario, right? Make up whatever you want into the lines. But let's say that happens. And let's say I look at that and I say, oh yes, I really need this. Thank you for sharing with me. I'm excited. I grab that book and I'm like, yes. And then I go to my car and I say, oh yeah, there was the radio show that I like is coming on. I toss the book in the back and I turn on the radio show and I'm off. And then a week or so later I find the book in my back and I'm like, oh yeah, I was going to read that. I need to do that. I should take that inside. I put it inside and then I forget because, hey, my favorite show just came on. And time just continues to go by, and before you know it, 3 or 4 weeks have passed. I meet back with my mentor and he's like, so what did you think of the book? What did you learn? And I'm like, I'm just getting started. I need a little more. I'm really kind of thinking about that earlier chapters. If you follow what I'm saying here. Mm-hmm. If I was going to be a good steward of the knowledge and wisdom that my mentor gave me, what would I do?
Read that book.
I would read that book. As a matter of fact, how many of you could just squeeze in, a book, maybe 6-8 hours? I don't know. Some of you maybe 2, some of you maybe 15. I don't know. How many of you can squeeze that time in like that?
Well, over what period?
This is what I'm getting. Doesn't it take a little bit of planning? I'm just saying, if I have to squeeze in a book and it's important to me, I'm not just going to stop everything and read for 16 hours. My kids are going to be hungry and going to be complaining. Well, actually, maybe not my kids. My wife will take care of that. But my wife might be giving me the evil eye. Like, where are you? And why are you over there reading? And that's fair, and she should. So how do I get around doing it so that when I meet back with my mentor in 3 or 4 weeks that I'm actually ready and have thought through this and have actually been a good steward of the wisdom he's provided? Yeah.
I think the question is also, why didn't you read the book?
Mm-hmm.
What was your intention? Why didn't you read it? And sometimes we don't read it because it's not so important. Mm-hmm. I have other plans and other things which are more important than this book, for example.
So that's the heart of it, yeah.
Yeah, we have to think about what I'm striving first.
So my heart of what I value, despite what my words may say, what I may feel in the moment, like when he gave me the book and I'm like, yes, thank you, I've been needing something like this. If I don't actually go through and read through it, that was the lie, the false, the emotion that quickly passed away. Proof is in my actions. I can say all day, thank you, and I'm going to do that, but if I don't actually do it, I don't really show that it matters. And you may argue all day long, well, habits are hard to form. Well, yes, they are. But if you actually want something, you're going to work hard to create the habit to do it. You can't just keep saying and making excuses. But what would I do if I do care about this and I don't want my life to get in the way? What do I have to do in order to make that happen? Think about it right now. I give you this book. You say this is really important to you. You're going to make it happen. What are you going to do to make sure it happens? Give me some practical examples. Yes, Jeff?
Well, you're going to have to give up something else,
Yes. You're going to have to make sacrifices.
whatever that may be.
And they have to be specific sacrifices, right? You can't just say, I'm going to have to stop doing some other stuff to get this working. That is going to be gone just as fast as anything else. I'm going to have to say, I need to skip lunch on Monday and read. Or I'm going to not watch this TV show on Thursday night so that I can read. I'm going to, whatever it may be. And involved with that, what else is happening? You're scheduling, right? I'm scheduling time. I'm saying, all right, Tuesday night's going to be the night I read. I'm going to spend 2 hours on Tuesday night. It should take me 3 weeks, and I'm going to be done. What else are you going to do? So you're going to schedule. You're going to set some sacrifices to make it work. You're going to make sure it's valuable to you. And maybe a little bit of, if I just read a book, and then put the book down and move on, how much do you remember when you do that?
You don't use it, you lose it.
Exactly. So whatever this looks like for you, whether you're taking notes and making a plan of action, whether you're just do it all in your head and you make a plan of action, that's fine too. But we got to make a plan of action that says, all right, I'm going to take these tips, this wisdom provided by my mentor through the book. I'm going to say, this would have value, and this would have value, and you're going to apply it directly, not 3 weeks down the road after you finish reading the book, but when I'm in chapter 2 and I get this neat idea that says, hey, spend 2 minutes on everything. If you can solve it in 2 minutes, do it right away, but if it takes longer, it's just basic time management principle. Or if it's going to take more than 2 minutes, I'm going to put it in a priority list and get back to it later. All right, you start doing that right then if you actually want to implement it. You don't wait 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, or even 3 hours. You start immediately, and you make a plan of action. That's how things go from an idea to an actual action. Everyone follow me? So I think it's not too hard of a concept. I gave you a real simple one. Let me give you a little more complex one. I'm a manager. I've got 10 people working for me. How many of you have seen the Verizon commercials with pathetic guy on the little Segway who runs over and he's like, so what are we planning today? And they kind of go through their little thing and he's completely amiss of whatever they're talking about. And they said, well, actually it would be this. And he's like, good chat, guys. And he runs away as if he's just solved the problem. You recall this? It was on during the Super Bowl. That's when I saw it. It may be stale and old. I don't know. I don't watch much TV. But anyway, that's the Dilbert-esque view of a manager. If you actually have a manager like that, get a new job. Please, just leave. Get another job. Because that is not where you want to be. A good manager, though, if he just sits like that and goes out and says, hey, guys, so what are we working on today? Good. Let me know. We'll chat again next week. Hopefully we go for the company, and walks off. What's going to happen with those guys that are working under him?
Undermotivated, underproducing.
It's going to be really hard, even if they're really diligent, to make a difference for the company. I mean, granted, if you're working for a company, what's your job? High-level job.
To do your
Computer.
best.
To make them money, period. Their money may be entered around some type of ministry, that's great. There's value statements we can add to it. But from a simple standpoint, if you go into your workplace and you're not adding value, you should not be working there, unless there is some roadmap that's going to get you adding value. So if you take a group of people and you put in charge of 10 people and you walk in those 10 people and you're not doing something to make them productive toward the reason that they've been hired and paid, you have failed miserably as a steward. So what would a good steward do with those 10 people? Same principles we talked about before. What do you do when you're managing 10 people that you want to produce well?
Find out what their strengths are, capitalize on those, and then tease out their weaknesses and mentor them toward better.
So there's this development of those employees that says, I'm going to help build into them so that they become better at what they're doing. Absolutely. What else?
Have a goal,
Got to have a goal, right? If they're really
a weather.
flash
warning.
flood, yeah. If we're having if they are working extremely hard and making great progress, but it's counterproductive to the company's success, then they are not earning their money. And it's the manager's fault, most often. You agree with me? I mean, these are pretty basic things. So you got to give them a goal. You got to say, all right, you're really sharp with Excel. Great. We need something like this that will help the company. I know you're working on this pathway, but you know what? We're not going to be. That's not really going to help our organization. So we need to shift your resources and bring it over here. If you could do this, you enable this, which enables this, which makes all of us better. And the person lights up. Oh, okay, I can do that. And then they run after it. That's what a good manager does, right? Takes time, takes scheduling, takes energy, takes a plan. Would you agree? So if I'm going to be a manager of servants or of employees, and I'm going to be a good steward of that, I got to do all these things. Otherwise, I am not faithful in my house. If you want to use a passage out of Hebrews 4 that talks about about Moses and Jesus. They were faithful in their house. This would not be faithful. But if I'm focused and bringing the best out of them, helping develop their character toward a particular goal to whatever my mission is by my master, then I'm succeeding. Now we're called to be stewards of God, so all of our time, money, energy is meant to be productive and for God's glory. So now let's take it into the plan of money. I just gave you two examples, one in the workforce, one in the mentoring area. Now let's take money. If I want to approach money the same way, God gives you $100,000. How do I be a good steward?
You might have to do some research into what
Education.
in your
Yes.
life, where you are.
Agreed. Now, that's the wisdom side, which is incredibly important, a big facet of this. What else on the practical side to make sure that money is where it needs to go? Andrew?
Keep your priorities straight.
Got to keep your priorities straight, and in order to keep your priorities straight, you have to know what's on the list, right? And so what would you call a list of priorities for your money?
Budget.
Yes, a budget. How many of you keep a budget? Good to know. Budgets are how you make sure your money obeys your principles. It's not your slave. I mean, it's not your master. You're not a slave to some other power. You're basically saying, I don't want my money to fly out through those holes in my pockets. I need to make sure my money is doing what my money's supposed to be doing based on the principles that I set up before God to know that is right. And once I set those up, I'm going to create a budget, and then I'm going to become a slave to my budget that I created. And if I need to change the budget, yep, we'll change it. But I'm not going to just be willy-nilly, throw the book in the back of the seat and let the money, oh yeah, I still have enough money in the account. Sure, we could probably go out today. That type of approach is not being a good steward. And if it was done in any other workplace, like for example, the employees, you get on a Dilbert column if you act that way. And if you do it to your mentor's no longer going to mentor you because he's fed up with you. You're lazy. So why would we think any different of our money? Because honestly, if you make enough money, there's some point where you don't really care where your money goes in terms of making sure you have enough in the account at the end of the month. But that's not what a good steward does, right? It's not simply about saying, I need to make sure I have some dollars left in the account at the end of the month. That is the approach of someone who's not He's just saying, give me more and I'm going to go focus. But so based on the principles that I believe I have to, I'm going to know exactly where those dollars go, so at the end of the month I can say, I have reserved as much as I can for the purposes that you've aligned with God. So budget is the mechanism with which we can force our money to behave. Because if any of you know anything about money, money doesn't behave when we don't control it. It disappears quickly. You go to the store and you pick up, I just need a couple cans of beans, and before you know it, $150 later, you got a cart full of, but you know, those Doritos are really yummy, I understand, but you got a whole lot of junk. Now granted, some of us may tell us this, well, you know, Chris, I'm really smart, and I can think really clearly, and I can make that organized plan on the go. That's great. If you can do that, great, but I don't believe you, because I think that if you actually budget yourself, whatever that brilliance you've got that's working and making you skate by is going to be that much better. Now granted, you may argue, how much time and effort do you spend on being a good steward of your money? That's between you and God. I'm not going to tell you have to do X, Y, Z or exact things, but I will argue this. If we truly recognize that the money's from God, and we truly recognize that we're called to be productive stewards for Him, then I think we have to call ourselves to be careful, and that we don't just spend money openly and without care, without thought, but we give it some thought. And whether that thought comes into a full zero-down budget that you're working on every day, or whether it be something a little looser, that's between you and God. I'm not really worried about it. But if you're not trying, you're not thinking, and you're not working toward this, odds are you're probably not being a good steward. We're out of time, and I didn't get to my second point I was trying to hit. So, let me summarize and tell you where we're heading next week so we make sure we get there. The very framework and nature of being a steward, when it comes to money, calls you into the practical manifestation that, at least the most obvious one, is a budget. You tell your money what it's going to do to make sure it aligns with your principles. And however that plays out in your finances, fine. But you got to use that anchor in principles to drive your money, not let your money show up later and you look back and say, oh, well, there's where my principles were. Instead, you tell your money what to do. And once we kind of get that direction correct, then we're going to bring in the next concept next week. I want to talk about debt. And I was hoping to give that today, but we're out of time. So the theology, what is debt? And to ask you to think about that last week, think about one more week, and come back and give me a theological definition of debt. And we'll go from there. Let's pray. Holy Father, I thank you for your word, for your truth. I thank you for hearing us and being involved with our lives and active. Lord, help us to rest in your faithfulness, rest in your goodness. Lord, I pray for those here that we would be better stewards with everything you've given us, but specifically with money. Lord, I pray that if there are areas we are missing, that we're not being good stewards with, that we're not controlling our money around the principles that you have committed us to, that we would make change, that we would make that today. In your Son Jesus' name I ask these things. Amen.
Amen.